banks of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio on the 1st of September, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was officially opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony featuring Yoko Ono and Little Richard, with an all-star concert the following night kicking off with Chuck Berry and Bruce Springsteen duetting on Johnny B. Goode. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, what a great name for a newspaper by the way, reported that 41 different combinations of artists had taken the stadium stage, playing 68 songs over the course of 6 hours and 40 minutes. The Hall of Fame had begun as a foundation in the mid-80s, with the idea of celebrating American music, just as similar institutions had done for sports such as baseball and basketball, but the question of where to site the physical museum had not been an easy one. Detroit, Motown, was an obvious candidate, as was Memphis, Tennessee, home to the Sun and Stax labels. Philadelphia was home to Bill Haley and American Bandstand, and so on. But eventually the case was made for the industrial city of Cleveland, which lobbied hard for the museum as part of a general reinvention of the city, on the grounds that it was the home city of DJ Alan Freed, an early champion of rock and roll, and local radio station WMMS had broken many acts such as David Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, Roxy Music and Rush in the US. The building featured a prominent glass pyramid and was designed by I.M. Pei, whose glass pyramid at the Louvre in Paris had opened 6 years earlier and been a sensation. And Derek Meddings died at the age of 64 of colorectal cancer. While not a household name, Meddings' work had been seen and enjoyed by millions. He started his career painting Transylvanian backdrops for Hammer horror films, but found his milieu doing model work and special effects for Jerry Anderson. He designed the Thunderbirds, as well as working on Stingray, Joe 90, Captain Scarlet, and moving into live action with UFO. But his big break came when he did some miniature work on Roger Moore's first Bond film, Live and Let Die, which got him noticed by Cubby Broccoli, and his miniatures and innovative visual effects became part of the Bond series, gaining him an Oscar nomination for his work on 1979's Moonraker, as well as designing the iconic submarine Lotus on the previous film The Spy Who Loved Me. Outside Bond, he ran the effects for Pink Floyd's shows in the 70s, did miniature and FX work for the first Superman trilogy, Tim Burton's Batman, Never-Ending Story 2 and 3, Cape Fear and Hudson Hawk. He even made a screen cameo in 1985's Spies Like Us, alongside fellow special effects legend Ray Harryhausen. At the time of his death he was working on GoldenEye, The Return of James Bond, scheduled for release in November, and the film was dedicated to his memory. On the 1st of September, Benetton announced that Jean Alesi's teammate for 1996 would be Gerhard Berger. Flavio Briatore had been talking to the Austrian since the beginning of August, but concealed his interest by putting about rumours about Barrichello and Frentzen. The Brazilian's agent, anyway, was said to be starting negotiations at $7 million, the same fee Alesi was reportedly getting, so that was probably never on the cards, but there were also other tricky negotiations between Briatore-owned Ligier and Jordan. The Irish team's Peugeot partners were said to be keen to persuade the French state tobacco monopoly, SATA, to switch allegiances and perhaps bring Olivier Panis with them. Fortunately for the boys in blue, former owner and founder Guy Ligier still had a few strings he could pull in the French government, and they would still be smoking Gitane next year, though the same technique wouldn't work on Elf, which had been recently privatised. As for Frentzen, well, Ron Dennis was reported to be interested, and indeed some suggested that Flavio Briatore had only expressed his own interest just to annoy Ron. But with Prost testing and Coulthard apparently lined up too, HHF decided to sign up with Sauber for a third year. Rumours said he would be joined by an increasingly dispirited Johnny Herbert, who gave an interview during the race weekend where he again lamented that he was having to survive on table scraps in terms of information and attention, and asserting that if he was given an equal car with Schumacher he was confident he'd be beating him. Other rumours put Johnny in a Jordan if Barrichello moved, with Brundle possibly moving to Switzerland instead. Prost's test at McLaren had taken place on the 30th to 31st of August, not the same weekend as Monza as I mistakenly said last time, which had gone well enough, but there was still no word from either him or McLaren. So, as everyone arrived at Monza, the 1996 grid was beginning to take shape. Schumacher at Ferrari, with both Alesi and Berger going the other way to Benetton, Hill and Villeneuve at Williams, Hakkinen and probably either Prost or Coulthard at McLaren, and Frentzen and possibly Herbert at Sauber. Jordan was the big question mark, with Barrichello very much in demand but wanting more money than most seem to want to pay, and also wanting number one driver status, while Irvine's contract was also still up in the air. There was also calendar news, as just before the race the FIA's F1 Commission met to approve the 1996 calendar, with Bernie Ecclestone now wanting to expand to 18 races. 17 had been a difficult enough sell, with the return of the Austrian Grand Prix and a new race in Indonesia at the relatively new Sentul International Circuit just outside Jakarta, with the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring once again shelved. As the Commission deliberated, the Austrian organisers said the Zeltweg track wouldn't be ready until 1997, and so they agreed on a 17-race season once again. Taking a look at the shrinking grid, Ecclestone had another proposal. Top teams, however that was to be decided, could be allowed to run a third car with a different sponsor. Christian Constant of Renault spoke for most of the manufacturers when he said, "It's unthinkable, it would strip our teams of all commercial identity," and the idea was quietly dropped. In Italy, of course, the big talking point was who would partner Michael Schumacher at Ferrari next year. The Tifosi were generally not keen on the German's arrival, seeing him as a mercenary who just went wherever the pay was better and was replacing a proper cut-him-in-half-and-he-bleeds Rosso Corsa Ferrari man, Alesi, with the announcement of Berger's departure not helping. Gerhard had driven more races for Ferrari, this would be his 90th, than anyone else, and while his tenure had coincided with the Scuderia's least competitive period in some time, he'd still managed to win 5 races for them, including that emotional 1988 win here just after the Commendatore's death. There were some who fondly hoped that test driver Nicola Larini, who'd ably deputised several times in recent years and could probably be relied upon to be a dutiful number 2, would get the nod, or possibly another young Italian like Luca Badoer, or the ever-overlooked Gianni Morbidelli, but the smart money was either on Barrichello or Coulthard, though both drivers were known to be unwilling to be a number 2 driver. In either case, the current drivers, Alesi and Berger, were even more in demand than usual at Monza, as this would be their Ferrari swan song in front of the Tifosi, and everyone wanted to be publicly seen saying their goodbyes. Goodbye too to Niki Lauda, who resigned, possibly not entirely voluntarily, from his role as special consultant, officially to focus on running Lauda Air, but most assumed he'd shot his mouth off once too often. Clay Regazzoni, his former teammate, was unsympathetic, saying he was in charge of driver relations and fell out with both of them. The fact that they were racing at Monza at all had been uncertain for months and was a chief reason for the season being extended to 17 races in case it had to be cancelled. The problem was that to make amendments to the track required by the new track safety rules, the track owners wanted to fell hundreds of mature historic trees in the Royal Park of Monza, which angered environmentalists and others. In the end, a compromise had been thrashed out. Some trees had been felled to move the corners inward a bit and create bigger runoff areas, but not as many as had been originally planned, and most of the track had been resurfaced while they were at it. But despite this, and ticket sales of 140,000 over the 3 days, Bernie Ecclestone still wasn't happy, reminding them that the current contract only ran until 1996, and adding, "The organisation's a disaster, the sponsors aren't treated well, you don't manage Formula 1 like a Formula 3 race." The new surface, in the end, meant the assembled Tifosi would have to wait a little longer for their chance to cheer Alesi and Berger, and scream abuse at Schumacher, because it had rained early on Friday morning and the new tarmac hadn't absorbed the water very well, so none of the serious players went out for half an hour or so until the sun, and the likes of Montemini trying out a new nose without the tea tray, had run it in a bit. At the end of the session, Coulthard had gone faster with Berger second, but it looked likely that Saturday would be decisive. The sun was out and the weather was dry, but again, thanks to the fresh tarmac, the best play was to go out as late as possible once everyone else had laid down rubber. So, for the first 20 minutes or so, to the increasing irritation of the fans, nothing much happened, until Hill took one for all the teams and went out first of the front-runners. Schumacher took a long time to find the right setup and left it very late to set his best time, while Hill made errors, small but big enough, on both days. So David Coulthard had his second pole position, over half a second ahead of Schumacher, with Berger 8/10 off the pace in third. He and Alesi, fifth, with Hill fourth, would have to trust to luck and attrition if they were to have a memorable last Italian Grand Prix. Barrichello was an excellent sixth, just 1,000th of a second ahead of Häkkinen, with Herbert a glum 8th, 1.9 seconds off pole and 1.4 off his teammate. Blundell and Frentzen made up row 5. Brundle was 11th and once again ahead of Panis, who went off twice in the attempt to outpace his veteran teammate, and Irvine down in 12th looked nervy and likewise went off twice. Papis was once again solid in the footwork, 15th, ahead of the two Tyrrells, and it was the two Minardis who both had offs on Saturday, especially Badour, who rolled it and then hit the barriers at Ascari. Inoue was 20th after 4 spins, and then came as usual the Pacifics and 40s, Lavaggi still well behind at the back, 8 seconds off pole and 4/10 off Diniz' 23rd place. Alesi cheered up the fans by going fastest in the warm-up, while Montemini and Brundle had a late coming together, which fortunately didn't bend either of their cars sufficiently to stop them participating in the race. Off they all went for the parade lap, only for Coulthard, caught out by his cold A-compound tyres, to spin off at the Ascari, apparently on oil drop during a support race. He kept it running and rejoined, but his car was damaged and all he could do was limp round to the pits to see if he'd be able to get into the race at all. So with Schumacher now effectively on pole and Berger with a free track in front of him, the red lights came on, then the green. Berger charged for the space in front and was squeezed over by Schumacher, with Alesi trying his luck down the other side, but Schumacher held his line, while the second Benetton of Herbert had made a fabulous start and leapt up to 4th, though of course that might just have meant he'd jumped it. But as they all went through the Variante Ascari, Papis and Panis nearly touched, spinning the footwork to a standstill across the track, as Katayama spun in trying to avoid him, and then the footwork collected Montemini and Moreno, while Bouillon and Diniz had to go the long way round. As they finished lap 1, there was a roar from the Tifosi as Berger pulled out from behind Schumacher and took the lead, but with 3 cars stationary across the track at Ascari, out went the red flag, and all Gerhardt's efforts were for naught. The race would be restarted from scratch for the full 53 laps, which meant that Coulthard would be able to take the start from pole in the spare Williams. Bouillon was also able to take the restart in the spare Sauber, but would have to do so from the pit lane, while both 40s had gone out, leaving Moreno out of luck, as Diniz, provider of much of the team's funding, was handed the spare FG01. With no spare Pacific, Montemini was likewise out of luck, remonstrations with the marshals notwithstanding, and so the restart would take place with 22 cars, with Moreno and Montemini going down as DNSs in the official standings thanks to the race being reset from lap 0. Coulthard, undoubtedly distracted by his error and driving a car set up for Hill, led away for the second formation lap, but there were no dramas this time, so they were once again ready to go. And off they went again, and Coulthard planted his foot and stayed in the lead, while it was Berger's turn to crowd Schumacher over, forcing the German to brake first and taking second place. Berger, clearly fired up, was all over Coulthard round lap 1, hoping to pressure the already rattled Scot into another mistake, but not this time, and at the end of the lap the order was Coulthard, Berger, Schumacher, Hill, Alesi and Herbert in the top 6, then Barrichello, Hakkinen, Brundle and Irvine, while Lami's race was run with a broken diff. Further back on lap 2, Panis and Salo were scrapping in midfield, leading to the Frenchman bouncing across the gravel at Roger and the Finn spinning to a halt and rejoining last. It was all go at the front, as Berger stuck to the back of Coulthard and Barrichello nabbed 6th off Herbert off camera. In fact, the top 5, the Williamses, the Ferraris and Schumacher, were already breaking away, as now Hakkinen had got past Herbert and was bearing down on Barrichello. Behind Herbert, Irvine was making progress, now up to 9th, while Brundle, Blundell and Frentzen were fighting over 10th. Lavaggi spun out under pressure from Bouillon, and then on lap 9, Blundell got past Brundle, with Frentzen also following through, and Panis now arriving on the rear of his teammate. Martin was in fact suffering a slow puncture, it transpired, and on lap 11 it burst just after the Curva Grande, leaving him to wobble all the way round the track back to the pits, shedding chunks of rubber and shredding bodywork. On returning to the pits, though, the damage was judged to be too much, and he was out. Up at the front, meanwhile, nothing had changed since the start, with Coulthard showing great composure in the lead, and now nearly 3 seconds ahead of Berger, who had Schumacher and Hill just behind. Then, suddenly, Coulthard's rear snapped out on him again, this time at the Roger. He kept it running, motocrossed his way through the gravel trap, and rejoined to head back to the pits again, while the Tifosi were on their feet as Berger was now leading the Italian Grand Prix. Coulthard, meanwhile, had made it back to the pits, only to miss his box and have to be dragged back, but it was all in vain anyway, as a broken wheel bearing was found which had left his wheel basically held on only by the brake disc, which had then failed. So on lap 16, Berger led Schumacher by 1.2 seconds, with Hill still firmly attached to the Benetton's rear wing, and Alesi nearly 3 seconds behind Damon in fourth, with Barrichello another 10 seconds back, and Häkkinen sixth, 2.5 seconds behind the Jordan, and a second ahead of Herbert. The leaders were in traffic, with Hill nearly collected by Katayama as he tried to get through in pursuit of Schumacher, while on lap 21 Panis's foot went all the way to the floor when he braked for the Rettifilo and spun to a harmless halt, so no points for Ligier this weekend. Meanwhile, as Schumacher and Hill were making their way through traffic, Alesi had also got right up behind the pair of them as Berger lapped Inoue, but when Schumacher and Hill lapped the Japanese driver on the way into the Roger, the Williams tapped the Benetton's rear as he came through, sending both spinning into the gravel. An absolutely livid Schumacher stormed over to remonstrate with Hill before being guided away by marshals, while the crowd went absolutely bananas because they were now Ferrari's first and second, with basically all of their main rivals eliminated. As if to celebrate, Berger set what would remain the fastest lap of the race just before coming in for his single planned stop. After a 15-second stop, Berger rejoined fifth, and on cold, hard tyres he lost 2 more places to Irvine and Blundell, as Frentzen and Badoer made their own stops. Next time around it was Alesi, then Barrichello, Häkkinen and Irvine. Crucially though, Alesi had got back out ahead of Berger. Badoer pranged it again, ending Minardi's awful weekend, and by lap 30 Herbert was leading, having yet to stop. He pitted at the end of that lap and with a fairly quick turnaround was back out third behind the 2 Ferraris, so after the pit stops it was looking like Benetton had again got the strategy exactly right. Häkkinen had also got ahead of Barrichello, so McLaren had won that particular battle with Jordan. If the Tifosi could have picked any outcome from the Italian Grand Prix, it would undoubtedly have been Alesi leading Berger home in a 1-2, with Schumacher ending the day in a gravel trap, but there was of course still a long way to go. And indeed Ferrari's dreadful luck was to hold, as Berger suffered an absolutely bizarre accident. The onboard camera fell off Alesi's car and smashed through his front left suspension. It would later transpire a Ferrari mechanic had leaned against it during his pit stop, weakening the mounting. It had been a lucky escape for Berger. If it had hit his helmet it could have been very nasty indeed. Nonetheless, a wave to the fans, but Berger was clearly crestfallen. Meanwhile, Alesi led Herbert by about 7 seconds, and Johnny was lapping faster, scenting an unlikely second win. On lap 40 of the 53 then, Alesi led Herbert, with Häkkinen another 7 seconds behind in third, then Barrichello another 6 seconds back, Frentzen 3 behind him, and Irvine 3 behind the Sauber. While Alesi was worrying that his rear suspension was starting to feel a bit spongy, it was all going wrong for Eddie Jordan. Firstly, the oil pressure in Irvine's car suddenly dropped, leaving him to park an overheated car at the side of the track, and while that was happening, Barrichello was finding his gearbox hydraulics were on the fritz and was losing 3 seconds a lap on Häkkinen in front of him. Before long, Frentzen had eaten up the distance and passed Rubens, who pitted at the end of lap 43 and was sent back out, only to pull over with a now broken hydraulic pump. So, with 10 laps to go, the last point was now being fought over by Mika Salo and Max Papis, with Bouillon not far behind. And then, disaster. With just 8 laps to go, Alesi radioed that there was definitely something up with his rear suspension, and the Ferrari pit got ready for him to come back for a quick look. Before he made it round, though, his right rear brakes were visibly lighting up. He made it round to the pits as Herbert swept through into the lead, but the team couldn't replace his right rear tyre. His wheel bearing had seized solid, and so just like 1994, an inconsolable Jean Alesi had retired from the lead of the Italian Grand Prix. And the race had another new leader, but the way things were going, you wouldn't bet against something happening to the number 2 Benetton to let Häkkinen or even Frentzen through for their maiden wins. Alesi climbed onto the pit wall to wave to the fans just as the TV director cut away to a replay of his brakes flaming out, but pretty much everyone left on the track was concentrating on keeping it running to get their best ever results. The 2 exceptions being Blundell down in 4th and Katayama, who'd been unable to get going again after his stop on lap 28, lost 5 minutes getting restarted and was now 10th and last but 6 laps down. As Herbert cruised away in the lead, a battle over the last point had developed between Max Papis and Jean-Christophe Bouillon, which was resolved on the penultimate lap as Herbert, Hakkinen and Frentzen all came home to their best or joint best ever finishes, with Blundell the best of his year in 4th, Silo scoring Tyrrell's first points of a very difficult year, and Bouillon nabbing the final point from Papis, with Inoue 8th, Diniz 9th and Katayama 10th the remaining finishers. Herbert gave Rubens Barrichello a lift back, and Flavio Briatore was probably glad to have something to take his mind off the argy-bargy going on behind the scenes, with both Benetton and Williams apparently protesting each other's lead driver to the stewards. Ferrari or no Ferrari, the Tifosi mobbed the track as usual for the podium ceremony, and you had seldom seen 3 happier drivers on a podium. It was not only Frentzen's first podium, but the first for the Sauber team too. While Hakkinen had a very tough year so far, this his first podium of the season, but also the first podium for a Mercedes engine since the Italian Grand Prix of 1955, and as an added bonus, the points for which, along with Blundell's for 4th place, put McLaren back in 4th in the Constructors' Championship. Sauber's points had likewise put them up to 5th, ahead of Ligier and Jordan, who had both failed to score. Herbert's 10 points, meanwhile, put him up to 3rd in the driver's standings, just to rub salt in Alesi's wound, while Hakkinen shot up the standings to 8th, a point ahead of his teammate Blundell, and 3 behind Frentzen. Norbert Haug and Wolfgang Schattling of Mercedes were ready to crack out the champagne after their first podium, but Ron Dennis was adamant, not until the first win, which he now felt couldn't be too much longer in coming. There was less optimism in the Williams pit, where the team were leaving with no points at all. Coulthard had been lucky to get away with his early error, only to be eliminated through a mechanical failure, again, and Damon Hill seemed to have simply had another brain fade and driven straight into the back of Schumacher. Taki Inoue graciously blamed himself, saying he hadn't seen Hill coming past on the other side to where Schumacher had gone through, and moved over on him a bit, but it was difficult to see how that led to Hill braking too late. Schumacher certainly wasn't having it, and said that Hill was now only trying to take him out and didn't care about anything else, which seemed unlikely as Hill now had a 15-point gap to close with 5 races to do it in, but the stewards agreed, at least insofar as Hill was held to be at fault, and was issued a 1-race ban suspended for 4 races, so now both championship rivals were racing under sufferance. And so to Portugal in 2 weeks' time, with Patrick Head promising a heavily revised new Williams that they fervently hoped might yet save their season.